Having a World War II veteran for a dad meant you most likely lived in a house with a real-life superhero. He didn't leap tall buildings in a single bound or carry a hammer heavier than gravity, but those guys fought the two most powerful armies on Earth at the same damn time, and won. You didn't know this, though. This was just your dad. You were Lois Lane. You didn't recognize the hero with his glasses on. But the something you did know was that you could get away with nothing with that man. You wanted to try telling your World War II dad how tough it was to get to school because you stayed up late studying? He was not having that shit, because he could probably have told you about the time he stayed up all night to patch a hole in a submarine using a dead shark. A shark he caught himself using only a pocket knife and a hat. "Oh, gee, Dad, can I skip mowing the lawn today? I hurt my foot playing volleyball." And he could have come back with, "Well, just because I broke my legs parachuting into London during an air raid didn't stop me from rescuing those orphans and nuns while carrying my injured buddy on my back after stitching up my own spleen." But he didn't. World War II dads kept all that to themselves. They were always going to be tougher than you, always, because when they were teenagers, they didn't have to try to be cool. They were cool. They were landing airplanes on ships in the middle of the night with one engine and no gas and probably bullet holes in the fuselage. They didn't want to hear about how you needed a calculator for math class when they designed rockets and computers on the backs of napkins using the stubs of pencils. They had the kind of attitude that can only come from men who, when watching their entire world catch fire, decided they could put it out with the sheer force of their will, and they did. And no matter how life may have beaten them up when they came home, they never lost that swagger. When my own World War II dad was 60 years old, he fought off 3 young muggers. He held them off with one hand while he kept his other hand on his wallet. They beat him up pretty badly, but the bastards ran away before they could rob him. "I kicked the ass of the Japanese Imperial Fleet, punks. I can take you too," I imagined him saying. Yeah, my dad and his buddies were pretty damned awesome, but they were also an enigma. You never knew much about them. They just came home from the war, got a job, got married, had some kids, well, lots of kids, and in their spare time, they created the middle class. My dad never talked about himself. The men of that generation never did. We all just assumed they came into the world fully grown and kick-ass tough. I had no idea who this man was, except he was the one who went to work, drove the car, drank beer, sometimes doing both simultaneously because back in the day I think you actually could. And he knew how stuff worked. I knew even less about the fathers of my friends. For instance, I have no idea what any of them did for a living. This, however, excludes the Flett sisters' dad, Jim Flett, who owned the only gas station in our neighborhood. Jim Flett also distinguished himself from all the other dads in that he did not care if he cursed in front of the kids. We all thought that was pretty cool, and we learned a lot of new words from him. He also stuttered a bit, so it was years before I realized the insult was not spoken as fuck you. But mostly my friends' fathers, other World War II dads, were the people who, when their car pulled into the driveway coming back from wherever they spent their days, I knew it was time to go home. By the way, those cars, designed and manufactured by World War II dads, were always incredibly long, like the early Carnival cruise ships. The back seat was yards away from the front, which was scary because, since no one wore seatbelts back then, you had the sensation of being airborne a little before slamming, face first, into the back of your mother's seat. It also meant the trunks were cavernously large. This was convenient for sneaking in a couple of friends at the drive-in movie because, come on, 50 cents a person? My own dad doubled down on this trend of aircraft carrier-size rides and got a station wagon version. With the back seats unfolded, you could fit the neighbor's car in our car. And because these cars were manufactured at the same time America was building spacecraft to carry us to the moon, They were designed with rocket booster-like fins. This was so our dads could feel a bit more like Flash Gordon and less like the captain of a four-wheeled conveyor of their scab-picking offspring, who whined about hitting their heads or falling on the floor every time their dad wanted to test his brakes. My parents were native New Yorkers, but after my siblings and I were born, they moved us to Miami, Florida, and because my dad was a Navy man living on a peninsula, he eventually, of course, bought an offshore tavern. But that was just my mother's term. To the rest of us, it was our boat. My dad and his buddies, other ex-servicemen, took frequent outings into the waters of the Atlantic in an attempt to see whose wife would become a widow first. Then in 1960, my mom and dad sold our house in Florida, loaded everything into a U-Haul trailer, and hitched that sucker to the back of our bronze and white colossal wagon, making it the equivalent of an army convoy. My dad, with no GPS, no online hotel booking, no roadside assistance, just a carton of Salem's, a road atlas, and unflinching confidence, drove his family and everything he owned across the continent. Why? Because it was a Sunday drive compared to fighting your way across the Pacific Ocean. His courage had already been forged in torpedo fire. We were headed west to California. This was Tony Bennett's idea. He recorded the song, "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," just to remind my dad how much he liked it there when he was stationed there while in the Navy. Now, as an adult, I realized that what my dad was romanticizing was being a young single man on shore leave with money in his pocket and hair on his head. A car full of smelly kids, empty donut boxes, and an exhausted wife would not give him the same thrill. Disappointment would soon follow, but he did not as yet know this. The world changed quickly for my dad. Tony Bennett was replaced by the Beatles. Giant Oldsmobiles were replaced by Volkswagen Beetles. And the world seemed to be forgetting what he and the thousands of his generation had accomplished. They got older, and no one could see the swagger anymore, but it was still there. It would always be there. My dad is gone now, as are most World War II vets, but a few remain. Go, seek one out. Tell him you appreciate what he did, and that you think he's pretty damned awesome. Maybe you can get him to tell you about the time he stopped a convoy of tanks sent to mow down a village of orphans by single-handedly blowing up a bridge using dynamite he made himself with gunpowder and the butane from his Zippo lighter, while suffering from a concussion and carrying a rescued puppy in his knapsack. Because that was all in a day's work for those World War II dads.